goes. Well, good evening. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, and this is Valley Beth Shalom live and online, and I'm delighted to welcome you this evening to a wonderful conversation with a very dear friend, Mr. Michael Halperin. Michael is a writer of novels, of plays, a teacher of writing, and has come out now with a brand new book, a book which is really worthy of our attention and our work. It's called My Name is David. Good evening, Michael. It's good to see you.
Good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's really good to have some time together and to share some conversation. Here's the book, and I've enjoyed this book a lot. I enjoyed the first one actually too. So let's talk about how this book came to be, and what its import is, because I know this is part of a story you've been telling, that you've told for a while, both to children and to adults. So tell us what this book is and how this book came to be.
I can tell you that in 3 words. Rabbi Harold Schulweis. He was the one who actually put me on the road to writing these stories. I was a screen and television writer, and he had been a rabbi, as you know, in Oakland. And when he was in Oakland, he met a young man who was taking his doctorate at Berkeley. His name was David Gilot. And David told him the story about how he was rescued by these 2 wonderful Polish Christians, Catholics, who rescued him and his 2 brothers. His older brother is Jacob Gilot, Gutgeld. The original name was Gutgeld, and his middle brother Shalom, and he was the youngest. David was born in 1938. Jacob was born in 1933. So there was a 5-year difference between the brothers. Rabbi Schulweis thought that I'd really be interested in the story of these Christian rescuers who saved David and his brothers from the Warsaw Ghetto. The story he told me originally wasn't quite the story that was the actuality. I think he conflated it with another story, but that wasn't so important as the story itself that I heard. And the only thing that I had was David's name. I had David Gilot. I didn't have a phone number. I didn't have an email address. I had nothing of that kind. And I had to get a hold of David. I wanted to find the Roslins. I didn't know where they were. I didn't know where they lived. I thought I had to see them. I had to meet them and perhaps do an interview if it was possible. So I did something which, I was sort of rash, I suppose, maybe. I called information in Tel Aviv. And I said, I'm looking for David Gilot. And they said, there are 8 of them. I said, well, start with the first one. So they connected me with David Gilot, number 1. And I said, hello, this is Michael Halperin. I'm in Los Angeles. Were you rescued by Alex and Mela Roslin? There was a long pause. And he said, yes, I was. And I said, incredible. And we chatted for a few minutes over the phone. And I said, where are they now? And he said, they live in Clearwater, Florida. He retired to Clearwater, Florida, and he's living there now. And he gave me their phone number. And I called Alex and Mela in Florida. And I talked to them, and I told them that I was really interested in doing a screenplay based on their story. And they invited me to come down. So I flew down to Clearwater, and I spent approximately 8 or 9 hours with them in their home. And I must tell you that both Alex and Mela were so warm and welcoming. Mela, for instance, she was like a bubby. She was like a Jewish mother. She prepared this incredible roast chicken and home-baked cookies and cakes and vegetables. I could have, quite frankly, I could have stayed there another few days. But it was wonderful. And after the interview was over, and I got all this wonderful information I recorded everything. I said goodbye, and before I left, Mela wrapped up some cookies and cake. And she said, these are for your children. And I took it home. A few days later, well, maybe not a few days, maybe a couple of weeks later, I received a phone call that they were leaving Clearwater, Florida. Now, Clearwater happened to be an area where there were a lot of Polish refugees who had come over after the war. But they were leaving Clearwater because something incredible happened. There was a story about the rescue that they did of Jacob and David, who survived the war. Shalom, unfortunately, died of typhoid fever in Warsaw under the Nazi occupation. But they were leaving because a story appeared in the St. Petersburg, in the Clearwater version, I don't know what they call it, version of the St. Petersburg Times, that they had done this rescue. And one of their neighbors, who had been a friend, came to their home, and Mela said to me, he said, "Why did you do what you did? So what if there had been 6,000,002? And they said, they decided at that point they could no longer live in that neighborhood. It just turned out that that particular story got back to Tampa, which is near St. Petersburg, and a Jewish real estate developer who built condos and apartment houses heard the story, and he offered them a condominium where they could live peacefully for the rest of their lives. And that's what happened until they died and went back to Poland. Their bodies, they're both buried in Poland. But that was when I heard that, I mean, it was like, it just tore my heart out.
That's amazing.
In the meantime, you have any questions to ask? No.
No, I want to back up just a little bit, because I think I know the beginning of the story, because I knew it from Rabbi Schulweis. Rabbi Schulweis was a rabbi in Berkeley, right. And he began this work of identifying and celebrating and sometimes even supporting Christians who rescued Jews during the Holocaust. Began this in 1963. Right. The first one was a man named Fritz Graebe that he met in San Francisco. He met Jacob Gilad. Jacob was a mathematician who was on a fellowship, I believe, studying at Berkeley.
He was taking his PhD. He was a PhD candidate at Berkeley.
Right, and Rabbi Schulweis, they were introduced, and he told Rabbi Schulweis the story that he and his two brothers were rescued by a Polish Christian couple. Right. And that's how his interest, his connection with the story, and that's how you got connected with the story.
Right. So in the meantime, I obtained a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to write the screenplay, focusing on Alex and Mela Roslin. Now, this was the time when the Holocaust series aired, if you remember that, and Schindler's List came out. Everyone read the story, read the screenplay. They thought it was just great. The screenplay was wonderful, but it was turned down by every producer who thought that the subject of the Holocaust was over and done with. They didn't want to do anything more about it. However, the screenplay did do one good thing. It became a calling card for me in terms of writing assignments. People read it and said, well, it's really great, but we'd like you to do something else. And that's how I got in. That's how I started writing a lot of television. And for 20 years, I did that. So after I realized that the screenplay wasn't going anywhere, Rabbi Schulweis and I had a conversation. And he suggested that due to the extraordinary relationship between the Roslins and David and Jacob, that it might be an interesting idea if I rewrote the story as a children's book, because it was a very uplifting story. It wasn't the typical Holocaust story where people die and they get killed and they sent off to camps and things like that. This was a case of people who were rescued, and it was a successful thing. Not only was it successful, but the Roslins refused to leave Jacob and David throughout their experience in Europe. And after the war was over and they traveled across Europe, the Roslins stayed with them until the Jewish Agency arranged for them to travel to what was then Palestine. And and that's an amazing story. The altruistic overtones to this story, which is so amazing. Well, anyway, I had no credibility as a children's writer, and I contacted a VBS member. Her name was Malka Drucker, who was experienced as a children's writer. And I asked her if she'd work on it with me, and she said she would. And using my research and the 38-page outline that I had and the screenplay, we wrote a book called Jacob's Rescue for children, 8 to 12-year-olds, which was ended up being published by Random House. It covered the years under Warsaw's Nazi occupation and the dangers that ensued until Russia drove the Germans from Poland. And subsequently, this is a bit of bragging, it has sold up until to date 500,000 copies. So it's done very well as a children's book. My Name is David picks up where the previous book ends. And due to the nature of the material, however, it's a book for adults because of the way the story is told. In terms of what the book, why I wrote the book, I think there are several. I would say it's on several levels. First of all, David had no memory of his parents. He lost his mother when she died in childbirth. His father fled the Nazi invasion of Poland when he was 13 months old. And Alex and Mela essentially became his surrogate parents, the only real parents that he knew. And there was an incredible close bond that developed between the Roslins and David. He and his brother were loved and protected as if they were their own children, at great sacrifice. Obviously, during the Warsaw episode, if the Roslins had been caught, they would have been summarily executed. And the children, Jacob and David, would have suffered the same consequences as the 6 million who died. And that just imbued itself within me and within the story. Most of all, I think, it's an ennobling story, demonstrating how rescuers who had no connection, no initial bond, saw the children and other Jews as deserving to live out their potential. To go to the present, David became a professor of mathematical sciences at Tel Aviv University, where he developed groundbreaking theories in something called probability mathematics. He wrote just about a year ago, he wrote a paper about it. And I said, oh, David, why don't you send it to me? I'd love to read it. And he sent me the paper. It was 3 pages of mathematical formulas. There wasn't an English word in it. It was just mathematical formulas. And I wrote back and I said, oh, it was clear. It was I understood it completely. What the hell was I reading? You know, I mean, that's exactly the kind of the genius we've got there. Jacob, on the other hand, earned his PhD in physics at the Weizmann Institute in Israel. He researched and developed radioactive medical isotopes in Israel and at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in Livermore, California, near Oakland. And Jacob was also on the staff of Sorek Nuclear Research Center in Israel. He's obviously retired now. Anyway, so that's so when I think about that, and I think about the children who lost their lives in the Holocaust and what they could have given to the world, a cure for cancer, Ebola, coronavirus, you know, all of those things are lost. But at least these two and obviously other children were saved as well. But Jacob and David survived, and they were incredibly, even as young children, by the way, they were incredibly curious, intellectually curious, brilliant in math and science, also pretty good with languages. They spoke Yiddish, Polish, Russian. Eventually, they learned a little German and French. So they were, you know, they were really sharp little kids.
As you studied the Roslins, Alex and
Yes.
Mela Roslin, the rescuers here, what were their motivations? What drives a person to risk their own lives, the lives of their own children, their position in a society, to rescue people that their society has turned against and considers an anathema? What drives people like that?
Well, I think, first of all, Alex was an iconoclast. That's the first thing. He broke every rule in the book. He hated the Nazis. He hated communists. He hated anybody who dealt with tyranny. I think that came from his father, who was also a bit of an iconoclast. and his father died when he was a teenager. Mela was quite religious. She was a very religious Catholic, but not in the sense of being so focused on piety, so much as focused on ideals and values. And Alex was one who really focused on the values of human life. By the way, he was very, very involved with Jews. Jews helped him start his original business in Warsaw. They funded him. They helped him with his business. And they weren't rich by any means. They were today they would be considered lower middle class. He dealt in selling bolt ends of fabric in Warsaw. But the one thing about Alex and Mela was they understood the value of human life. The best example of this was during the war, during the Nazi occupation, he undertook a remarkable task to try and arm the Jewish fighting organization inside the Warsaw Ghetto. At night, late at night, when the Nazis were out there, soldiers were out there, he would have a cart, and he would slip up to the wall of the ghetto where the Jewish fighting organization had dug tunnels under the wall, and they would give him anything they had of value, whether it was a piece of silver, a piece of jewelry, earrings, whatever it was. He would then take that and he would take them to the partisans, and he would say, and he would barter those for guns and weapons. And he would take those guns and weapons and then trundle them back in a cart to the wall in the ghetto and ship them into the ghetto. And one day he said to one of the men of the Jewish fighting organization, "I want to get inside. I want to see what's going on. We've heard a lot of rumors." The guy said, "You're crazy. If they find you in there, they'll kill you." He said, "I don't care. I've been able to avoid getting killed all along. I've done everything I can to do this." And he was a bit of a charismatic character anyway. So they said, okay. So he got him into the tunnel, and the next morning they put a band around his arm with a star, a Jewish star, so that they would think he was a Jew. And he got out and he came into the ghetto, and he's walking through the streets of this ghetto, and people are in absolute misery. And these little kids who are skinny little kids running up to him, all they want is a penny, a drushki, a crumb of bread. And the young man who was with him from the JFO, the Jewish Fighting Organization, said, "Don't give them anything." He said, "What are you talking about? They need it." He said, "They're going to die anyway." And he pointed into a corner where this building, he said, and he saw what looked like a stack of wood. Those are children who have died. And he went home, and he just, it was like an incredible apotheosis. And he went home and he told Mela, he said, "We've got to save some children." And she said, "Well, you can't save them all." He said, "We can save one. We can save one. Isn't that more important?" She agreed, and there happened to be the family, the Gutgeld children, and he happened to know somebody who knew the Gutgeld children. Had been the Wolf Gutgeld, the grandfather, had been on the Warsaw City Council, and they were fairly well to do. And he had been their chauffeur. He said, "These children are inside the ghetto. Do you want to get them out?" And they took them out one by one. The story of how they got them out is in the book, Jacob's Rescue, how he managed to do it in a very clever way. And they brought them to their home, and they kept them in the house for, I think it was 3 years under Nazi occupation. Even though they were reported on many times by their neighbors that there were Jewish kids there, the police came, the Gestapo would come, and they had little hiding places for them. So, and then when the war ended, when the Nazis not invaded, but when the Nazis decided, I'm sorry, let me go back a little bit. The Polish partisans revolted against the Germans, and they drove them out of the city for a brief period of time, but then the Germans came back in major force. And under bombardment and under the terrible weather that was raining and pouring, big thunderstorms, they escaped from Warsaw. And they got to a little small farming village in a town called Kaminsk, which is just south of Warsaw. And this place would have been decimated by the Germans. All the Jews in the town had been taken away in 1939 and sent to concentration camps. They were all, except for maybe, I think 50, they all were killed. So there were no Jews left in the town. And they settled there for about 2 years until the Russians came and drove the Poles out and drove the Germans out of the area. And that's where my story picks up, by the way. That's where it picks up at that point, when the Germans are finally forced out. But that's how that started. He saw these children. He said, we need to do something.
It's remarkable because, you know, we associate the principal theory of Nazi evil is Hannah Arendt's observation of the banality of evil.
Yeah.
It's what the conclusion she came to at the Eichmann trial, that Eichmann wasn't an evil mastermind or an evil genius or an evil monster. He was an ordinary man who was turned into an extraordinary instrument of evil in the world. And what you've described, and I think, you know, we share this experience of having met rescuers through Rabbi Schulweis, is the banality of good. That simple people that you would not be able to identify on the street because they don't have halos and they don't have wings and they don't wear medals around their chest. Just simply people who are willing to do such heroic acts of goodness simply because it's the right thing to do. So how did it, what happens to you as the author who's living with these people through the course of writing this story, telling this story, sharing the story? How does it change you, Michael?
Well, first of all, they all became my friends. Alex and Mela actually stayed at my home in Sherman Oaks. Remember when we had that special program? They stayed with me, and I met them, and they were like my grandparents almost, if you will. That's the way they were. Jacob and David also became my friends. Jacob and David stayed with me also, and we had and I met them. Remember when we went to Israel on your tour with you, and we broke off, and at the end we stayed longer. And the reason I stayed longer, we went to Tel Aviv, and we stayed and we visited with David and Jacob at that time. And I think it was 2002, I think it was. And we stayed with them at that time. And we've remained family ever since then. But I tell you the one thing that was impressive. I asked Alex and Mela, I asked them the same question you did. Why did you do what you did? And he looked at me and he said, because someday when my children ask me, what did you do? I wanted to have an answer. Just as simple as that. I wanted to have an answer. And that was his reasoning. The other thing that I remember very well is when he was at the VBS and you asked him to speak, Rabbi Schulweis asked him to say a few words, and Alex had a very thick Polish accent and broken English. And he looked down, and David was in the audience because David met him at the airport in Los Angeles. And David was in the audience, and he looked down at David. He said, "You know, I'll try. I can't exactly do the imitation the way he did it, but he said, you know, I'm very lucky. They could have been bums." And he smiled. I mean, he was doing it. It was with a twinkle in his eye and a smile on his face. It was such a wonderful kind of coda to this whole event of celebration of heroism. But
right.
That's the way he was.
The book is a wonderful story. I mean, it moves really. It would make a great movie, by the way, if you ever want to go back into the writing of the film. But I want to think about it in a broader context now. We're surrounded with a sort of moral insanity in the news and in the community. And here you open a book and you read about people whose goodness is so genuine, whose heroism is so authentic and pure. In a moment when good and evil were very clear. It was very clear who the good guys and the bad guys in the story are and in the world are. and I wonder what do you, if you had to help us draw a bigger message from this particular story and from the story you told with Jacob, from these two stories, from the experience of these two men who started as young boys and are now made serious contributions to science and culture about us. What are the what's the great lesson here?
I think the great lesson for me, at any rate, was that people stepped up with incredible nobility of character to protect the vulnerable. Now, this is something we learn in Torah, to protect the poor, the innocent, the orphan, the widow, the stranger in our midst. They didn't read that part of it, but they knew it. They understood it. No matter the differences that they had with the people that they rescued. And unfortunately, most of those people have vanished today, the rescuers. But the number of those who witnessed those acts of altruism are also disappearing. And I think we have a responsibility to remind the world over and over again that those heroic deeds must never be forgotten. That's what I get from it. Not only that, but sometimes people laugh at the idea of altruism. In today's cynical world, altruism, how can you be altruistic today? Why be what good does it do you? I don't want to quote somebody I know in Washington, but what do you get out of it? What do you get out of it? You're a sucker, you're a loser if you do that kind of thing. Well, I'd rather be a sucker and a loser in this particular instance than be somebody who wins only for the sake of winning. And I think that's part of the story. That's part of the story. If you want me to, I can read a couple of things from the book, which sort of express some of these things. And
I think that'd be nice. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Some of them are fairly mundane. A couple of them are mundane. A couple are serious. I need to set it in context, though. David. First of all, David had an insatiable curiosity that led him on when he was a young child. He was only 7 at this time. He had an incredible, insatiable curiosity that led him on adventures, but he never informed Alex and Mela about them. He would just go off and do things. That was his nature. And in Lodz, Poland, a Jewish friend who had no idea that Tadek Roslin, because his Polish name was Tadek, and everybody thought he was the Roslin son. Tadek Roslin was actually David Gutgeld. They hopped a trolley and they rode through the devastated city. They roamed through some place called the Poniatowski Park that was named after the nephew of the last king of Poland. And it got late and he finally decided to go back to, he had to get back home, and he did get back home. And as a result, he was supposed to meet with their new tutor. And when he arrived, the tutor was waiting for him, and Alex and Mela were not very happy with him because he had just vanished and they didn't know where the hell he was. So when he walked into the apartment, which was a bombed out apartment, basically broken windows, broken furniture, they did what they could to make it look nice. I'll just read. This is where this is a slight, attractive, dark-haired young woman in a plain dress and sensible flat-heeled shoes sat on a sofa with Jacob and Marisha. Marisha was the Roslin's daughter. She was the same age as Jacob. David slipped into the room and stood near the door. "This is Wandering Tadek. He also needs your help," announced Alex. Mela rushed to David. "We were so worried. Don't ever wander off again." "You should come to the movies with us. It was wonderful," said Marisha. "It was awful," groused Jacob. "A movie with singing and dancing and princes and princesses kissing. I wanted to see soldiers and cowboys." "Miss Rosenberg isn't here to talk about the cinema. She's here to plan what she needs to teach," said Alex. "Mr. and Mrs. Roslin said you're very good in math. It's not my best subject, so perhaps you can educate me." We can have fun learning about history and geography. What do you know about the history of Poland? Ella Rosenberg asked. David's arm shot up. I know a little. You don't know anything about Polish history, grumbled Jacob. I know all about Prince Joseph Poniatowski. He was the nephew of the last king of Poland and fought against the Russians who tried to take over our country. Very good, said Ella. One of his best friends was Kosciuszko. Not only was he a military officer in Poland, but Kosciuszko went to America and helped win their war against the British, said David. Ella shook his hand. It seems we have a scholar in our midst, she said. Now, Ella Rosenberg was from Palestine. She was sent by the Jewish Agency to tutor Jewish children in Poland. And they were so lucky to have her. She was an amazing, she had a tremendous impact on Jacob and David. And she taught them for about a year and a half before they ended up going to a regular school. And she wrote these wonderful letters back when they finally found that their father was alive and living in, of all places, Palestine. The grandfather and the uncles and their father had escaped the invasion of Germany in 1939, crossed into Russia, down through the Crimea, and finally got to Palestine. And that's where they spent the war years. And everyone thought that they were dead, that they had died.
Wonderful story. Thank you. Just a marvelous story.
There's another.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, go ahead.
There's another story which I think is interesting. On April 30th, 1945, Lodz was rejoicing at the news of Hitler's death. And out of anger and a sense of justification, David decided he was going to deface a Hitler stamp in Jacob's collection. Not a good idea. Jacob, 5 years older, went ballistic. And David ran away until he reached a walled villa that just fascinated him. And David climbed an oak tree and over a wall, crawled out on a thick branch. Trendles and grass was sprouting in the driveway and the cracks in a brick drive curving up to a large 2-story house. He didn't know what it was. Figures of 4 children sat in the center of a fountain. And it was a dry fountain, obviously, and it wasn't really working. And David peered through the windows trying to find out what was going on in there. And inside he saw all these furnishings and statues lining the hallway. All of a sudden, an armed Russian soldier crashed through the undergrowth. He yelled at him. He said, "Little boy, get away from there," he yelled. David scrambled to the grass. "I only wanted to look. You had your look. Now get on your way." And he said, "Does anyone live here?" "No one lives here. Move before I arrest you." "I'm only 7 years old," said David, defiantly. The soldier said, "I don't care if you're 107 years old. Move your skinny legs as fast as possible, or I'll take you to my commanding officer. He's not as nice as me." "Someone must have lived in this house," said David. "Will you leave if I tell you?" asked the frustrated soldier. "Right away," promised David. The Germans used the house as one of their headquarters. It's under guard because we're looking for evidence we can use when they surrender. They stole paintings from the villa, but left almost everything else in place. "Who lived here before the Germans?" asked David. "You had your answer questions," said the soldier. "You only answered half a question. Someone lived here before the Germans took over." "You're a clever little chap." When the family of a wealthy Jewish merchant owned the villa, the Germans invaded. They escaped to Vilnius in Lithuania. It didn't help. They were rounded up and sent to a ghetto. And I hope their ghosts haunt the Nazis for the rest of their lives. "Enough history. Now get out of here before I get in trouble," ordered the soldier. That's just an example of David's innate curiosity. There was another part of the story which because I mentioned in the synopsis that about the anti-Semitism. That was a tragedy. On the day that the war ended, there was a big celebration in Lodz, and everybody went to a park, and everybody was celebrating. They were eating sausages, and all sorts of things were going on. And he was walking through the park, and he saw and a little old Polish lady saw him and patted him on the head and said, "You're such a nice little boy. So good to see you. Aren't we glad the war is over?" And another old man was there, and he leaned on his cane and he said, "Did you hear about what happened in Rostov? They found a bunch of Jews hiding. They beat the hell out of them." And this little old lady said, "I thought Hitler did a job. I thought he was going to exterminate them. Poland is for the Poles, not for the Jews." And Jacob and David just couldn't believe that these people who had lived under Nazi oppression for so long still harbored that kind of hate.
Right. And it and it's still there. It's still there. Not just in Poland, but around the world. Michael Halperin, thank you for this wonderful contribution. The book is called My Name is David, A Search for Identity. It's available on Amazon and wherever you find books in the world these days. It's a wonderful read. It's a very, very exciting and deeply moving read, and I recommend it really highly to everyone. So thank you for joining us tonight, Michael.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you to everyone who's watched us tonight. We wish you a wonderful evening.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.